The Seattle rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Julian's impeccable living room, the kind of quiet Friday night he usually cherished when Elena was away on business. But as her text lit up his phone screen, "I miss you so much, but the trip got extended." His eyes snagged on the attached photo of her hotel room, specifically the reflection of a man's silver watch on the glass table. There are fractures in a marriage that happen silently, long before the breaking point is ever acknowledged. If the delicate, dangerous unraveling of perfect lives draws you in, stay with me to see how deep this betrayal goes. The rain in Seattle rarely fell in dramatic sheets. It usually manifested as a persistent gray mist that blurred the edges of the city. But tonight, out it beat relentlessly against the glass of Julian's living room windows, mirroring the sudden, violent shift in his reality. He sat in the leather armchair. Elena's choice, Italian, absurdly expensive, nursing a glass of Macallan. It was 11:14 p.m. Elena was in Chicago. She had been there since Tuesday for a PR summit, and she was supposed to catch a flight back tomorrow morning. Julian had spent the evening reviewing blueprints for a new commercial complex downtown. He was a structural engineer. His entire life was dedicated to understanding load-bearing walls, stress points, and the exact moment a foundation would give way. He just never thought to apply that science to his own marriage. His phone buzzed on the mahogany side table. The screen illuminated the dim room, displaying a notification from Elena. "I miss you so much, but the trip got extended. Client crisis. I'm so exhausted. Wish you were here. Going to sleep now. Love you." Julian smiled faintly, the instinctual warmth of 7 years of marriage rising in his chest. He picked up the phone, tapping into the message thread. Below the text was a photo, a classic "wish you were here" shot. 2 glasses of room service wine on a glass-topped table, the glittering Chicago skyline framed by the hotel window in the background, a crumpled white duvet at the edge of the frame. It was a perfectly composed picture. Elena always knew how to frame things. Julian zoomed in, his thumb swiping across the screen to look at the city lights. He missed her. The house felt too large, too hollow when she wasn't moving through it, filling the space with her rapid-fire phone calls and the scent of her Le Labo perfume. But as the image enlarged, his thumb stopped. The glass table in the hotel room was highly polished. Beneath the stem of the second wine glass, caught in the harsh glare of a bedside lamp, was a reflection. It was slight, distorted by the curve of the glass, but undeniable. A man's wrist. And on that wrist, a heavy, distinct silver watch with a sapphire dial. Julian's breath hitched, stopping dead in his throat. The silence in the living room suddenly felt absolute, deafening, pressing against his eardrums. He stared at the screen until his eyes burned. He knew that watch. He had sat across from it at 3 different charity dinners. He had watched it slide across a conference table to shake Elena's hand. It was a Patek Philippe Nautilus. It belonged to Marcus Thorne, the CEO of the tech firm Elena had bent over backward to sign as a client last spring. "I miss you so much." Julian read the words again. The whiskey in his stomach turned to lead. A cold, clinical detachment began to spread through his veins, the same feeling he got when he saw a hairline fracture in a concrete pillar. It wasn't the collapse itself. It was the terrifying certainty that the collapse was now inevitable. He didn't call her. He didn't text back. "Who is with you?" Or is that Marcus's watch? Instead, Julian slowly set the phone face down on the table. The screen went dark. He looked around his perfectly curated living room at the life they had built together, realizing with a sickening clarity that it was already a ruin. She just hadn't told him yet. The heavy oak front door clicked open at precisely 6 o'clock on Sunday evening. Julian was in the kitchen, a chef's knife in his hand, systematically slicing an onion for a dinner he suddenly had no appetite for. The rhythm of the blade against the wooden cutting board was the only thing anchoring him to the present. "Julian, I'm home." Elena's voice floated down the hallway. It sounded melodic, carrying a practiced weariness. He set the knife down, wiped his hands on a towel, and walked out to the foyer. Elena was kicking off her black pumps, her designer trench coat draped effortlessly over her arm. She didn't look like a woman who had spent the weekend wrestling with a corporate PR crisis. Her skin had a flushed, hydrated glow, and her posture lacked the tension that usually accompanied a stressful work trip. She looked entirely, devastatingly satisfied. "God, what a nightmare," she sighed, dropping her leather weekender bag onto the rug. She walked toward him, wrapping her arms around his waist and pressing her face into his chest. Julian braced himself. It took every ounce of his willpower not to flinch, not to step back and let her stumble into the empty space. Instead, he raised his arms and lightly rested his hands on her back. He closed his eyes and breathed in. Beneath the familiar, spicy notes of her Le Labo perfume, there was something else. A faint, masculine trace of bergamot and cedarwood. It was expensive. It was intimate. It was clinging to the fabric of her silk blouse. "I missed you," she murmured against his shirt. "I missed you too," Julian replied. His voice was steady, a perfectly calibrated lie. "How was the rest of the trip? You said the client was spiraling." Elena pulled back, rubbing her temples with two perfectly manicured fingers. A textbook gesture of exhaustion. "It was endless. We were trapped in conference rooms until midnight both nights. Marcus was being completely unreasonable about the new press release. You know how he gets." "Marcus." Julian repeated the name softly, testing the weight of it in the air between them. "Always demanding." "Exactly," Elena agreed smoothly, though Julian caught the micro-expression. A fraction of a second, where her eyes darted toward the staircase before snapping back to him. Her pupils were slightly dilated. "I just need a hot shower. I feel like I've been living in airports." Julian watched her pick up her bag and ascend the stairs. He analyzed the geometry of her movements, the confident sway of her hips, the way she effortlessly compartmentalized her life. He returned to the kitchen and stared at the half-sliced onion. His hands were trembling. Later that evening, while Elena was in the shower, Julian walked into their bedroom. Her weekender bag lay open on the velvet bench at the foot of the bed. It was uncharacteristically messy. Elena was usually meticulous about unpacking, separating her laundry into designated bags. Tonight, garments were hastily shoved together. He stepped closer, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He didn't dig through it. He refused to cross that line just yet, but his eyes caught the edge of a receipt protruding from the side pocket of her makeup bag. It wasn't from the grand business hotel where the conference was held. It was a receipt for room service from the Langham. Here's a luxury boutique hotel on the other side of Chicago. The shower turned off. The sudden silence in the master bathroom was like a gunshot. Julian smoothly turned away from the luggage, walking toward the dresser to adjust his watch. When Elena emerged in her silk robe, a towel wrapped around her wet hair, she smiled at him through the steam. It was the same smile she had given him on their wedding day. For the first time in his life, Julian understood how buildings collapsed. It wasn't always an earthquake. Sometimes the foundation just rotted quietly in the dark, until there was nothing left to hold the walls up. At 2 in the morning, the house was perfectly still, save for the rhythmic, even breathing of the woman sleeping beside him. Julian lay flat on his back, staring at the shadows playing across the ceiling. Elena was deep in slumber, her face soft and untroubled, one arm draped over the empty space between them. To the rest of the world, it was a portrait of domestic peace. To Julian, it felt like lying next to a loaded weapon. He carefully slid out from under the heavy duvet, his bare feet touching the cold hardwood floor. He didn't turn on a single light as he navigated the hallway and descended the stairs to his ground-floor study. The darkness felt like a necessary shroud. Sitting at his oak desk, Julian opened his laptop. The screen flared to life, casting a sterile blue pallor over his face. He and Elena shared an iCloud family plan, a convenient setup years ago to sync calendars, grocery lists, and shared purchases. It was a digital tether of trust. Julian was an engineer. He knew that systems, no matter how complex, always left a trail if you knew where the stress points were. He bypassed her main inbox and went straight to the recently deleted folder of her synced email account. Most people, he reasoned, emptied their trash, but busy people on business trips often forgot. His cursor hovered over a cluster of automated emails. There it was, Uber receipts. He clicked on the first one, dated Thursday night at 11:42 p.m. The pickup location was the Palmer House, the official venue for her PR summit. The drop-off location was the Langham, a 5-star hotel miles away. A second receipt, dated 5:15 a.m. the following morning, showed the exact reverse route. This pattern repeated on Friday and Saturday nights. Julian stared at the digital map on the screen, tracing the thin black line of the route with his eyes. That little black line was the exact measurement of her lie. While she was texting him about working late in conference rooms, she had been crossing the city in the back of a black car to meet Marcus Thorne. His chest tightened, a phantom weight pressing down on his sternum, but his hands remained perfectly steady. He opened the shared App Store purchase history. Elena was a creature of habit, relying heavily on standard Apple apps for her communication. But there, buried beneath a recent update for a meditation app and a digital magazine subscription, was a download logged 3 months ago. Signal, private messenger. 3 months ago. That was precisely when Elena had secured the contract with Thorne Technologies. That was when the late-night client calls had started. The sudden need to step out to the patio for privacy, the subtle, almost imperceptible shift in her availability. Julian leaned back in his leather chair, the silence of the house pressing in on him. He didn't need to hack into the app. He didn't need to read the words they exchanged. The infrastructure of the affair was laid bare before him, architecturally sound and utterly devastating. She had built a parallel life, complete with hidden transportation and encrypted channels, all while coming home to arrange fresh flowers on their kitchen island. He closed the laptop. The screen went black, plunging the study back into darkness. He sat there for a long time, the chill of the room seeping into his bones. The anger he expected to feel, the hot, blinding rage of a betrayed husband, never materialized. Instead, there was only a profound, hollow grief. The woman upstairs, the one whose perfume lingered on the sheets and whose toothbrush sat next to his, was a stranger. The foundation had not just cracked, it had disintegrated into dust. The dining room was bathed in the warm, amber glow of the Murano glass chandelier. Elena had spent the afternoon curating a tablescape of white ranunculus and brushed silver, an aesthetic triumph meant to impress their guests. David and Sarah, a corporate lawyer and a real estate broker who traded in the same affluent Seattle circles. Julian sat at the head of the long mahogany table, swirling a heavy Cabernet in his crystal glass. He felt entirely detached from his own body, like a ghost haunting his own life. The conversation flowed effortlessly around him, a meaningless current of stock portfolios, private school admissions, and summer plans for the Hamptons. "So, hi, Elena," David said, leaning back and gesturing with his silver fork. "How was Chicago? Did you finally get Thorne Technologies to sign off on the new media strategy?" Marcus Thorne is notoriously impossible to please. Julian did not look at David. He looked directly at his wife. Elena smiled, a bright, practiced expression that didn't quite reach her eyes. She reached for her water glass. It was exhausting, honestly. Marcus is particular. We spent the entire summit locked in conference rooms at the Palmer House. I barely saw the city. "A tragedy," Julian interjected, his voice low and smooth. The table went quiet, shifting their attention to him. He offered a tight, polite smile. "Chicago is a beautiful city. It's a shame you didn't have time to see it. Though I hear some of the boutique hotels are quite nice. The Langham, for instance. Have you ever been, David?" Elena's hand stopped midway to her mouth. The water in her glass trembled, sending a microscopic ripple across the surface. It was a fraction of a second, a glitch in the matrix of her composure. But Julian caught it. "The Langham?" David pondered, oblivious to the sudden drop in atmospheric pressure at the table. "I think Sarah and I stayed there years ago. Over by the river, right? Great spa." "Exactly," Julian said, his eyes never leaving Elena. She had set her glass down, her fingers gripping the stem with a white-knuckled intensity. "I imagine it's the kind of place one might go to escape the noise of a crowded summit." "Well, I wouldn't know," Elena said. Her voice was slightly higher than usual, the melody strained. She offered a quick, dismissive laugh and turned to Sarah. "Honestly, the highlight of the trip was just getting on the plane back to Seattle. The weather there was dreadful." "I'm just glad you're back," Julian said gently. He picked up his wine glass and took a slow sip. "You seem different since you returned, more relaxed. Perhaps the stress of dealing with Marcus finally paid off." He watched her swallow hard. The flush on her neck was no longer the rosy hue of good wine and conversation. It was the sharp, mottled red of rising panic. "He did sign off on the strategy, ultimately," Elena managed to say, her eyes darting to her porcelain plate. "So yes, it paid off." "Excellent," Julian replied. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. "I've actually been thinking of getting a new watch to celebrate our upcoming anniversary. Something classic. A Patek Philippe, maybe. The Nautilus has a certain authoritative weight to it. Don't you think?" The silence that followed was suffocating. David and Sarah exchanged a confused glance, lost in the sudden, sharp pivot of the conversation. But Elena froze entirely. The air vanished from her lungs. She stared at Julian, her eyes wide, searching his stoic, impassive face for any sign of a joke, any hint of accidental coincidence. She found nothing but cold, architectural calculation. I wouldn't know much about men's watches," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the soft jazz playing from the hidden speakers. "No," Julian agreed softly, his gaze slicing through her carefully constructed facade. "I suppose you wouldn't." He picked up the silver carving knife to serve the roast, his hands perfectly steady, leaving Elena to drown silently in the center of her perfect dinner party. The rain had returned, a steady, rhythmic drumming against the frosted glass of the Pioneer Square Tavern. It was 3 o'clock on a Tuesday. The bar was mostly empty, smelling faintly of old leather, polished brass, and spilled gin. Julian sat in a high-backed booth, tracing the condensation on his glass of club soda. Across from him sat Nora. 2 years older and infinitely more cynical, his sister was a partner at a downtown law firm, a woman who viewed human emotion as a variable to be managed rather than felt. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer and a look of practiced neutrality as she scrolled through the screenshots Julian had transferred to a secure tablet. The reflection of the watch, the Uber receipts, the hidden app download history. Nora didn't gasp. She didn't offer a sympathetic hand. She simply set the tablet face down on the scarred wooden table and picked up her martini. "Messy," she said, her voice perfectly level. For a woman whose entire career is built on optics and public relations, leaving a digital trail like this is remarkably sloppy. But arrogance usually is. "I thought I was going to be sick when I found it," Julian admitted, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "At the dinner party on Sunday, I practically told her I knew. I watched her stop breathing, Nora. And then she just recovered. She poured more wine and asked Sarah about real estate." "Survival instinct," Nora replied, taking a slow sip. She fixed her dark eyes on him. "So, what is the plan, Julian? Do you pack a bag tonight? Do you throw her clothes onto the lawn and change the locks?" "I don't know." Julian rubbed his temples, a dull ache throbbing behind his eyes. "I just want it to be over. I want her out of my house." "It is not your house," Nora corrected him sharply, the lawyer seamlessly taking over the sister. "It is your house, plural. Washington is a community property state. You bought that craftsman after the wedding. You renovated it with joint funds. You started your engineering firm while married to her. If you blow this up tonight on raw emotion, she walks away with half the equity, half your business, and a hefty alimony check." Julian stared at her, the cold reality of her words piercing through the fog of his grief. "She is the one sleeping with Marcus Thorne," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "The court doesn't care whose bed she is in," Nora stated flatly. "They care about spreadsheets. If you file tomorrow, Elena will hire a shark. She will spin the narrative. She will claim you were emotionally absent, obsessed with your blueprints, and that the marriage was functionally dead long before Marcus Thorne bought her a drink at the Langham. She will make herself the victim of a neglectful husband, and her PR firm will make sure your social circle believes it." Nora leaned forward, tapping a manicured fingernail against the dark wood. "Heartbreak is a luxury, Julian. Divorce is a business transaction. Right now, you are the only one who knows the contract is void. That is leverage." Julian looked down at his hands. He thought of the load-bearing walls he designed, the meticulous calculations required to ensure a structure could withstand immense pressure before failing. He had been looking at his marriage as a home that was falling apart. Nora was telling him to look at it as a controlled demolition. "What do I do?" he asked. The tremor in his voice was gone, replaced by a chilling calm. "You go home," Nora said softly. "You kiss her on the cheek. You ask her how her day was. You give me 2 weeks to quietly untangle your finances and move your liquid assets into protected trusts. You document every late night, every unexplained charge. You don't just leave her, Julian. You build an airtight case, and then you trap her in it." Julian picked up the tablet, slipping it back into his briefcase. He looked out the window at the gray Seattle afternoon, feeling the last fragile threads of his love for Elena harden into steel. 2 weeks, he said. The ballroom of the Fairmont Olympic Hotel hummed with the low, expensive frequency of Seattle's corporate elite. Beneath the cascading crystal chandeliers, waitstaff in black vests moved silently, offering flutes of champagne to venture capitalists and tech executives. Julian stood near a massive marble pillar at the edge of the room, a glass of sparkling water resting against his palm. He was exactly where a supportive husband was supposed to be, present, impeccably dressed, and entirely background noise. In the center of the room, commanding the atmospheric pressure of the entire gathering, was Marcus Thorne. Thorne was a man who wore his wealth and influence like a second skin. He was taller than Julian, broader in the shoulders, styled with a silver-templed charm that demanded attention without having to ask for it. He was currently holding court with 3 prominent investors, laughing at something one of them had said. The Patek Philippe Nautilus, the same watch from the hotel room photograph, glinted under the ballroom lights. And standing just to his right, bathed in the glow of Thorne's undeniable gravity, was Elena. Julian watched her with the clinical precision of a man evaluating a structural failure. She wore a backless emerald gown that clung perfectly to her frame, her hair pinned up in a way that exposed the elegant curve of her neck. To the rest of the room, she was simply the brilliant PR strategist managing her firm's most lucrative asset. But Julian knew how to look closer. He knew the blueprints. He watched the way Elena's posture subtly angled toward Marcus, an unconscious, magnetic pull. When Marcus spoke, Elena didn't just listen. She absorbed him. Her eyes held a luminous, captivated quality that Julian hadn't seen directed at him in over 2 years. The investors dispersed, leaving Elena and Marcus momentarily alone in the crowded room. Julian's grip on his glass tightened, the cold condensation freezing against his skin. He watched Marcus lean in slightly to say something meant only for her. It was a marginal shift in proximity, perhaps 2 inches closer than professional decorum dictated. Elena laughed, a low, genuine sound that vibrated with an unguarded warmth. As she laughed, she reached out to take a fresh glass of champagne from a passing tray. At the exact same moment, Marcus reached for one as well. Their hands brushed. It was a fraction of a second, a collision of knuckles over a silver tray. But neither of them pulled away immediately. The contact lingered for a heartbeat too long. Marcus's eyes dropped to Elena's mouth, and a heavy, suffocating tension seemed to envelop them, rendering the hundreds of people around them completely invisible. In that micro moment, the last vestige of Julian's hope turned to ash. A physical affair was one thing, a transactional mistake made in the sterile environment of a luxury hotel. But what he was witnessing was far more destructive. It was an ecosystem of shared secrets, an intoxicating intimacy that lived and breathed right in front of him. She wasn't just sleeping with Marcus Thorne. She was entirely alive with him. In a way, she was dead with Julian. Nora's voice echoed sharply in his mind. "Heartbreak is a luxury, Julian. Document it." Slowly, deliberately, Julian pulled his phone from the inside pocket of his tuxedo jacket. He didn't raise it like a tourist. He held it waist-high, angling the camera lens through the crowd. He snapped a single, silent photograph of the 2 of them, the way Marcus was looking at her, the agonizing proximity of their bodies. He slipped the phone back into his pocket, the device suddenly feeling as heavy as a stone. He took a slow, deep breath, smoothing the lapels of his jacket, preparing to walk back into the light and ask his wife if she was ready to go home. The annual PR Foundation Gala, held beneath the soaring glass atrium of the Seattle Art Museum, was the undisputed crown jewel of Elena's professional calendar. It was a masterclass in calculated opulence, awash in the low hum of classical strings and the clinking of baccarat crystal. For Elena, it was a night of triumph. Her firm had exceeded every metric, largely due to the Thorne Technologies account. Julian sat at the central VIP sponsor table, the structural epicenter of the room. To his left sat his wife, radiant in a midnight blue gown, her smile a permanent, brilliant fixture. Directly across the centerpiece of cascading white orchids sat Marcus Thorne and his wife Victoria, a woman of inherited wealth and quiet, intimidating grace. Rounding out the table were two of Elena's senior partners, men who viewed her as the future of their firm. Beneath the table, Julian felt his phone vibrate once against his thigh. It was a text from Nora. "Papers filed. Trusts are sealed. You are clear." It was the green light. The final safety protocol had been disengaged. Dinner had just been cleared. The table was engaged in a polite, murmuring discussion about the upcoming tech quarter. Julian picked up his glass of Pinot Noir, took a slow, measured sip, and set it down. He didn't tap his glass with a silver spoon. He didn't stand to make a scene. He simply leaned forward, resting his forearms on the crisp white linen, and shifted his gaze to the woman sitting across from him. "Victoria," Julian said, his voice smooth and conversational, yet carrying a density that immediately drew the attention of the entire table. "I realized earlier this evening that I have been terribly remiss. I have something that belongs to your family." Elena turned to him, a faint furrow appearing between her brows. Marcus paused, his wine glass hovering an inch from his mouth. Julian reached into the breast pocket of his tuxedo and withdrew a sleek, heavy manila envelope. He placed it on the table and, with 2 fingers, slid it slowly across the smooth expanse of the tablecloth until it rested directly in front of Victoria's gold-rimmed charger plate. "What is this, Julian?" Elena asked. The practiced melody of her voice had thinned, replaced by a sudden sharp edge of uncertainty. Julian ignored her. "Marcus left something quite distinct in Elena's hotel room during the Chicago summit last month," he continued, maintaining unbroken eye contact with Victoria. "A Patek Philippe Nautilus. It cast a rather beautiful reflection on the glass table in a photograph Elena sent me late one night. Along with it, I've included the Uber receipts detailing his 2 a.m. commutes to the Langham and the encrypted messaging logs they've shared since March." The silence that fell over their table was absolute, a sudden, suffocating vacuum in the middle of a crowded ballroom. The ambient noise of the gala roared on around them, completely ignorant of the detonation that had just occurred. Elena's face drained of all color, transforming into a mask of pure, bloodless horror. She opened her mouth to speak, to spin, to deploy the crisis management skills she had honed for a decade, but her throat simply closed. Marcus lowered his glass. The charming, silver-templed titan of industry looked suddenly hollowed out, his eyes darting frantically to the senior partners, who were staring at the envelope as if it were a live grenade. Victoria Thorne did not gasp. She did not look at her husband. With a frightening composure, she reached out, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the light, and opened the clasp of the envelope. She slid out the 8x10 glossy photograph of the hotel room, zooming in on the watch, followed by the neatly printed spreadsheets Nora had compiled. She studied them for 5 agonizing seconds. Then, she carefully placed them back inside, folded her hands in her lap, and finally turned her head to look at Marcus. The disgust in her eyes was cold enough to freeze the air. Julian stood up. He buttoned his tuxedo jacket with deliberate, steady fingers. He looked down at Elena, who was now trembling. Her perfect posture shattered, tears finally pooling in her wide, terrified eyes. There was no hatred left in Julian, no fiery vengeance, just the exhaustion of a man who had successfully brought down a condemned building. "Enjoy the rest of your evening," Julian said softly to the table. He turned and walked away, navigating the sea of evening gowns and tuxedos, leaving the ruins of his marriage behind him without ever looking back. The Seattle morning was colorless, a flat, oppressive white that drained the vibrancy from the manicured lawns of their neighborhood. Inside the Craftsman house, the air felt thin, stripped of the warmth it had held for 7 years. Boxes were stacked in the foyer, their brown cardboard surfaces an ugly intrusion against the pristine white wainscoting. Julian stood by the kitchen island, watching the steam rise from his coffee. He felt a strange, buoyant numbness, the kind that follows a major surgery once the anesthesia has settled in. The house was quiet, but it wasn't the peaceful quiet of a weekend morning. It was the hollowed-out silence of a structure whose internal supports had been removed. The sound of footsteps on the stairs was heavy and hesitant. Elena appeared in the doorway, wearing a simple gray sweater and leggings. Her face was pale, her eyes rimmed with red and puffy from a night of crying that had done nothing to wash away the consequences of the gala. The brilliant, sharp-edged PR executive was gone. In her place was a woman who looked suddenly, jarringly small. "The movers will be here at 10 for the rest of the furniture," she said, her voice sounding raw and thin. Julian nodded, not looking at her. "I've already moved my things into the guest suite. You can take the bedroom set. I don't want it." Elena walked into the kitchen, stopping several feet away from him, as if there were an invisible barrier she no longer had the right to cross. "Julian, please, just talk to me for a minute. Not about the lawyers or the house, just talk to me." "There's nothing left to say, Elena," Julian replied softly. He finally turned to look at her, and for the first time, he didn't see his wife or his betrayer. He saw a stranger with whom he had shared a very long, very expensive mistake. "The blueprints were faulty from the start. I just didn't want to see the cracks." "I loved you," she whispered, the words trembling with a desperate late-stage sincerity. "I do love you. Marcus was... it was a fever. It didn't mean anything." Julian set his coffee cup down with a quiet clack against the marble. "That's the most insulting part of this entire ordeal. If it didn't mean anything, then you destroyed our lives for nothing. You traded 7 years of history for a fever and a luxury watch. That doesn't make it better, Elena. It makes it pathetic." She flinched as if he had struck her. She looked around the kitchen, the high-end appliances, the custom cabinetry, the life they had curated to look perfect for every dinner party and social media post. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to live in a house that isn't a lie," Julian said. "And you should probably call your firm. I heard this morning that Thorn Technologies pulled their account after Victoria filed for divorce. The senior partners are looking for someone to blame." Elena's hand went to her mouth, a sharp intake of breath escaping her. The reality of the professional suicide she had committed was finally sinking in. Her image, her career, her marriage, the entire trifecta of her identity had been leveled in a single evening. "Goodbye, Elena," Julian said. He didn't wait for her to respond. He walked out the back door and onto the patio, breathing in the damp, cold air. He listened to the sound of her heels clicking across the floor one last time, the sound of the front door opening, and the final heavy thud as it swung shut. He sat on the cedar bench he had built himself during their first year in the house. The rain began to fall again, a soft, persistent drizzle that blurred the edges of the world. He was 42 years old. His marriage was a ruin, and his home was half empty. But as he sat there in the gray light, Julian felt the pressure in his chest finally begin to ease. The structural failure was complete. The debris had been cleared. For the first time in years, he was standing on solid ground.